Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the Scholar Spotlight series. We are thrilled and honored to have Dr. James Murray back on our stage with Epistemic Injustice and Ethnic Erasure, how the emphasis on racial proxies undermines cultural specificity. Dr. James Murray, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for spending your Saturday afternoon with me. I imagine you guys may have better things to do, but you're here with me, and I'm thankful. So, the title of my discussion is Epistemic Injustice and Ethnic Erasure, the emphasis on racial proxies undermine cultural specificity. And I'm talking about this for a couple of reasons. Number one, I am talking about the end of affirmative action, race-based affirmative action, and U.S. higher education. And since the end of race-based affirmative action, the Trump administration has tried to, I believe they tried to, they're looking into how universities use racial proxies, like, or race neutral proxies, right? Like socioeconomic status, first generation status, zip code, as a racial proxy, right? So, as a racial proxy to get around the 2023 Supreme Court decision ending race-based affirmative action. But what I noticed about that, and that all this talk about race, what gets undermined is ethnic specificity, particularly toward a group referred to as American descendants of slavery. About 4 years ago, I talked about this /issue about the issue of racial disaggregation among those classified as black/African American. I talked about that because ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery, have a specific justice claim in the context of the United States. They're the descendants of American chattel slavery. They were chattel slavery was sanctioned by the American government. But the category Black African American places all people of African descent under this racial umbrella, where lineage and ethnicity basically is a monolith, right? So the things that happen to a specific ethnic group, say ADOS, the thing that happened to them and their ancestors is essentially erased, right? Because they all operate under the umbrella of Black African American. So and the problem with this is that further problems with this is that is under the umbrella. And let me start. In the case for reparations, I should say, and you all may have been hearing a lot about reparations since probably the year 2019. And the year 2019 is a special year because it was the 400-year anniversary of the 28 Africans arriving in Virginia. The first enslaved Africans, allegedly, the first enslaved Africans arriving in Virginia. So it's been on the national radar for about 7 years now. And I think it's important to realize that um, the issue the issue of ethnic erasure, the issue of flattening of Black culture, right? Instead of thinking of a Black culture, it may be more appropriate for us to think of Black cultures, right? Um, so I want to get into who ADOS are, right? What is ADOS? So as I said previously, ADOS are American descendants of slavery. And the name is very intentional. The name is, um, I think the name speaks volumes about um, what the identity is trying to convey. So if you if you I don't know are very media literate and you consume media, especially news media, and have been aware of this reparations discourse in the past 7 years, um, people often, when they say ADOS, they don't actually get the acronym correct. They'll say things like African descendants of slaves, or African descendants of slavery, or American descendants of slaves. But the name is American descendants of slavery. First of all, the American part is to designate that this is a specific American ethnic group. And the emphasis is not on the emphasis is on the institution of slavery. Um, so you're not referring to the people that were enslaved as slaves. You're referring to the institution, the thing that made them enslaved, the thing that subjugated them is what you're trying to emphasize. That these are Americans who were enslaved, right? Not Africans that were enslaved. These are people of African descent who were enslaved, but they are American. Um, and so um, another thing about this group is that ADOS are, um, again, they are distinct lineage. Um, they're distinct lineage created over a roughly 400-year period in the United States. Um, um, Forged over centuries, and having a continuous presence in the United States, right? So, uh, one thing that I often think gets dismissed about um, ADOS culture is that it's a hybrid culture, right? And there is something that I would like to read, if I may jump online for a second. And I'm not sharing the screen, but there's something I would like to read that speaks to this. And I actually shared this used this in my dissertation. This is from an article called "I Am an African American, Distinguishing Between African American and African Applicants in Medical School Admissions Matters." And I want to make sure, can you all hear me clearly? Is it a yes? Can I get a yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. So, so I want to read this statement, and I think this succinctly, like not even really succinctly, but it fully captures, right? It fully captures. It's kind of a long couple of paragraphs, but it captures the kind of unique nature of or of ADOS, or Black American identity. And the doctor goes, I am a uniquely American product. My father's lineage traces back to a slave on a tobacco plantation outside of Annapolis, Maryland. My mother's lineage flows through free people of color, mulattoes, who fought for the American colonies at Yorktown and other engagements during the Revolutionary War. My father's lineage passes through slaves on the same plantation as a maternal ancestor of Alex Haley, the author of Roots. The saga of an American family. My mother's through the Chestnut Ridge people of West Virginia. Genetically speaking, I am a sub-Saharan West African, Northern European, and Native American. Although no amount of genetic testing can tell me who I am from both everywhere and nowhere. I am the descendant of an enslaved and oppressed people, originally from sub-Saharan Africa, who contributed greatly to what is uniquely American. From jazz to midwifery, I'm an African American. And I think that statement about identity, like it fully captures like the hybrid, the hybrid constitution of Adolf's identity. Not merely as like Africans in America, but this is a culture, an ethnicity created in the crucible of the United States. So, so what I've been trying to do for the past few minutes is just to lay down what makes Adolf distinct, what makes him a distinct ethnic group. So now I want to talk about like how these race neutral proxies, such as socioeconomic status, first generation status, and college admissions, and maybe zip code, kind of undermine that specific justice claim for reparations, right? So, so often, often in the U.S., like because of things like redlining, because of things like discrimination, higher education, uh, being excluded from certain aspects of the job market. Black Adolfs are disproportionately represented in these categories. However, people have to remember that not all Black Americans are Adolfs, right? So you have growing numbers of people who are considered Black/African American, coming from places like the Caribbean, come from places like the continent of Africa, and South America, from all over the world. And yet they are considered, when they come to the United States and they mark on the census or on the college application, they would mark Black or African American as well. What gets missed in that is that even though, say for college admissions, even for state college admissions, even though these proxies may benefit ADOS people, because ADOS people are disproportionately represented in certain zip codes or certain rungs of the socioeconomic ladder, it fails to account for the specific things that put this particular group in those positions, right? And that's not merely just being Black, right? Because there are Black people from all over the world that come to attend America's universities that have not experienced this, right? Because they didn't exist in the context of the United States, right? They weren't here. So essentially what I'm saying is that like a racial fix, a broad the broad social category of Black, African American, and racial fix does not necessarily repair the damage that was done to ADOS folks, right? Given their history of slavery and discrimination in the United States. Um, so I want to, 1 second. I lost my notes. 1 second. Okay. Um, I think one thing we need to pay attention to is one question that, like the Trump administration, looking at universities and saying, "Hey, using this as a proxy for race, right? Using socioeconomic as a proxy for race, and we'll make sure you're just trying to get around the you're just trying to get around uh, the Supreme Court decision in 2023, right? Because you can't explicitly use race, right? Um, but what I hope, what I hope to convey is that, um, or better yet, what this stuff about race and putting so much emphasis on race and how this undermines claims of traceable harm because of one's ethnicity or one's lineage. Um, it had me thinking. It makes me wonder, like, why? Because I talked about this in my dissertation. Why is it so hard? What is the issue? Like, what is the problem? Like, why are all Blacks, people who are racialized as Black, seen as uniform in terms of culture, right? And like, for example, like when I watch, I consume a lot of media. I'm a media guy and a reporter in the past life, a journalist in the past life. And one thing that I get really upset now, um, when people even use the term Black culture, because when they say that, when people generally say that, I'm assuming you're talking about ADOS culture, right? That's the default. But in the way that we use Black, it can refer to anyone who we see as phenotypically Black, right? And a being of African descent. So I really don't know who they're talking about, right? Um, and so the issue seems to be about this failure to pay attention to ethnic specificity and lineage specificity seems to be structural. Like, how did the society come to view this particular racial group as a monolith, regardless of where they're from in the context of the United States? Um, in my dissertation, I talk about Afro-pessimism. I use Afro-pessimism because I thought it was a powerful meta theory, an ontological meta theory to help explain why the category of Black or Blackness was seen as kind of amorphous. And Afro-pessimism, essentially, this is the theory. I encourage you guys to look him up and maybe read some of his essays. But Dr. Frank Wilderson III, he has a book called Afro-pessimism, and he has a book on called Red, White, and Black. That's very interesting as well. But the pessimist perspective basically says that, Blackness is a creation from the transatlantic slave trade. It comes from the aftermath of that. And Blackness, or being Black, is an ontological category. It's a category of being. It's a category of being from which uh, the category of human distinguishes itself. So black and human are separate. They're not the same thing. Blackness does not equal human, or it doesn't fit into humanity, the category of humanity. Um, so for Afro-pessimism, the Western world, or most of the world operating in a Western of frameworks, working in Western frameworks, see blackness as um, again a thing from which humanity is distinguished, but also it's seen as fungible, right? It's seen as substitutable. It's seen as interchangeable, right? So one black person is just as good as another black group there, or one black person is just as the same as another black person anywhere else in the world, right? Their cultural distinctions, their ethnic distinctions don't matter. In fact, because they're not even quote unquote really human, it's of no consequence. It's of no consequence to even acknowledge it. Um, and in fact, like we may not even care to even see it. Again, because it's of no consequence. So, um, so Afro-pessimism like offers a great explanatory power for understanding why certain structures, certain institutions, certain uh, I don't know, um, how a how people in the world um, operate in terms of how they or how people view blackness, right? Um, I think another thing to add about Afro-pessimism and what it offers in terms of explaining why uh, blacks are viewed as a monolith is because um, not only does it stand outside of humanity, but blackness is also a form of social debt, right? So there's the lack of a social recognition of one's humanity. And I think one way to one example of this, or there's several examples, but one way to see this is like by one example of this is by looking at um, the kind of the string of deaths of black men at the hands of police officers over the past, I mean, before I was born, frankly, but specifically in the past maybe 10 to 15 years, right? So we have people like Oscar Grant, um, people like George Floyd specifically, right? That's the most recent big case. But and how a lot of these cases are just kind of I noticed that like these things happen so often. We kind of approach them with a kind of indifference or a kind of um, it's not out of the ordinary now. Um, it's not outside of the realm of a possibility. It means it, it it seems like it's just a matter of course now, right? That things happen, and a lack of social recognition, a lack of this social depth seems to correlate to the kind of indifference that I see um, related to the deaths of these black men. Um, so, and again, I want to. I mean, Afro-pessimism. There are criticisms about Afro-pessimism, but Afro-pessimism, I think, has great explanatory power in terms of understanding why uh, people people within the realm of humanity, as Afro-pessimism would say, see Black people as a monolith, see Black people as not um, as not uh, or why Black people are not socially recognized in terms of ethnicity. Ethnicity implies culture. Ethnicity implies tradition. Ethnicity implies a language, right? And that stands within the realm of humanity, right? That stands in the realm of humanity. And since blackness is seen as fungible, replaceable, substitutable, um, I mean, it's almost as if blackness operates as a kind of the way that it operates in the same way in which blacks were brought to the Western world in the capacity of slave, right? You were fungible as a slave. You were replaceable as a slave, right? Your individuality, your distinctiveness didn't matter because you were here to do a job, right? You were here to operate to fulfill a certain goal, right? Um, so, and I want to go back a little bit. I think if listeners are interested, I think one book that would be good to read in terms of forming the formation of Black American or ADOS, people who will later become ADOS, Black American identity, is there's a book called Exchanging Our Country Marks, Marks, by Michael Gomez. And Gomez talks about the kind of coalescence of various African ethnicities from West and Central Africa when brought to the United States kind of came together and formed a national identity primarily based on race because they were race when they were brought to what would become the United States, right? So it's a very unique book about how several groups just kind of came together and formed essentially a new ethnicity from various ethnicities, right? So I mean, I love the book, and I would recommend that for readers if they want to know more about that. Um, so Afro-pessimism, again, it has a lot of explanatory power, and I think um, so. But I want to go back to why, beyond culture, beyond lineage, why it is important for um, ADOS to not be subsumed, completely subsumed into the category of Black African American, particularly for any kind of um, anything that relates to traceable harm related to being a part of that group. Um, because that group has been, I mean, again, they were subject to slavery, Jim Crow, redlining. I'm sure people know these things, but in the course of that, there was a lot lost. There's wealth deprivation, or that is to say, the inability to accrue wealth over time because of one's status, right? There's exclusion from land, the inability to move to certain states or buy homes in certain areas. Like many of you may be aware that certain neighborhoods in America in the mid 20th century had racial covenants. Some of them kind of still in books that uh, more or less are ignored these days, but they had racial covenants that you couldn't have certain, you couldn't have Black folks basically moving to the neighborhood, right? Um, that was part of your agreement. Um, and so, in the realm of higher education, where I study, education has a specific has played a specific role in building itself up on the backs of ADOS. For example, you have Georgetown, which was able to keep its doors open because of the selling of the enslaved. You have now they have a project which many of you can which you can look up. They have a project about regarding the descendants and bringing about repair to the descendants of the people who were enslaved or who were sold specifically to keep the doors of Georgetown University open. You have universities like the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's baby, and they have um, they have a descendants community where they gather information about uh, or people who are interested in seeing if they had a ancestor who worked on the property or property owned by UVA. And also they've instituted a scholarship program, which by the way doesn't seem to really help many people. Um, and the entire state of Virginia has passed a law back in a few years ago allowing for um, that specifically pointed out those who are descendants of the enslaved who worked um, at certain public universities in Virginia, or those who were enslaved in Virginia, who had ancestors were enslaved in Virginia, um, are favored for these particular scholarships. These scholarships are specifically for them. And one university, I think it may have been Virginia, is it Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU? I believe that's the university there. They uh, kind of went back on it and they made the scholarship more inclusive, right? So it's not specifically for the descendants of the enslaved anymore. Um, and again, that's a reaction to the Trump administration. That was a reaction to the Trump administration kind of um, putting its foot down on trying to enforce the Supreme Court ruling from 2023 and then race-based affirmative action. And I also want to say that I want to go. I'm kind of all over the place, but all these things are interconnected. One thing I want to say too, the Supreme Court case from 2023 was actually divided into two cases. But so when this happens, the Supreme Court kind of brings the two cases or multiple cases together and come to a final conclusion, right? Or a final conclusion, right? Just like, for example, Brown versus the Board of Education ending racial segregation in public education in the United States. That was based on a series of similar cases, right? And it coalesced into Brown versus the Board. So there was a case in 2022 with Students for Fair Admissions versus who are the plaintiffs who are arguing that universities are engaging in race-based affirmative action uh, that discriminates against Asian students, white and Asian students. And in this specific case, the plaintiff's lawyer said um, let me go back. Brent Kavanaugh, Justice Brent Kavanaugh asked, what if someone were a descendant of a slave? Would that be considered um, a racial proxy? Would someone being a descendant of a slave in the context of the United States, would that be considered a proxy for race? And um, the lawyer essentially said, yeah, that would be considered a proxy for race. For most Americans, they would see someone saying that they're a descendant of a slave as essentially black, right? Black and a descendant of slave is the same thing. Ironically, though, I found this very interesting is that um, when asked about immigrant status, could someone being an immigrant, could that be considered a proxy for race? Um, and the plaintiffs answered no. Even though 80% of foreign students attending American universities, at least 80% are non-white. I found that really interesting, and that's a particular exchange between the justices and the plaintiffs. It speaks volumes about um, it speaks volumes about how blackness shows up in the American psyche. And I think it speaks volumes. It speaks volumes to the explanatory power of Afro pessimism and helping us understand um, why blackness is seen this way, why blackness is seen as just this one thing. So, and I guess to put it in more philosophical terms, it seems like uh, the lawyer's answer to Judge Kavanaugh that being a descendant of a slave would be um, basically a byword for a black person. Um, speaks seems to suggest that we lack, or many people in particular in this society lack the conceptual resources to understand ADOS as a specific ethnic and lineage affiliation. Like it's not there. It doesn't exist. And again, Afro pessimism does a great job of explaining that, why that is. So, and another theory or concept that helps explain this is Miranda Fricker's concept of epistemic injustice. And epistemic injustice is basically has to do with kind of like a wrong done to someone because there's no conceptual framework or um, for the thing, or for that person, or for that group. Or, for example, if someone is suffering from a disease, this person goes to the doctor over and over and over and over again, because the medical and it's misdiagnosed, or the doctors can't find anything. But that person ends up dying later because of unnamed X disease. And when that person dies, the doctors found out, oh, we found this new disease in this person. We're going to call it X, whatever, or call it Y, whatever. one could say that person suffered an epistemic injustice because there was no concept or no understanding of what disease that person had in the first place, right? They had nothing to draw from. They had no idea what it was. So that person couldn't get treatment for it. And in terms of ADOS, like there is no framework or understanding or how a group categorized as Black/African American can have a specific ethnic identity completely formed in the United States, right? Um, so because of this, like, so ADOS justice claims are heard um, as racial rather than lineage based, right? Um, so the cultural history of ADOS, right, people, becomes unintelligible. It becomes unintelligible, and or I should say, it's unintelligible because it's indistinguishable from the large Black African American amorphous category, right? Um, and so, um, yeah, so I think, so epistemic injustice, the concept of epistemic injustice, specifically hermeneutical injustice, right? Um, like we don't have uh, the resources to interpret what you're witnessing, right? Um, I mean, it's a structural failure in our society. It's a structural failure in our society. Um, and it's written all over legal documents. It's written in the census. It's written in just the racial categorizations that we have in our current society. Um, and I think one way, I talk about this in my dissertation, but one way to address this is through, um, some of you may be familiar with the ethics of care. Uh, I use the ethics of care as formulated by Joan Tronto, excuse me. And you know, ethics of care tends to have four tenets. So that's attentiveness, responsiveness, responsibility, and competence, right? And overall, like ethics of care requires a special relationality between um, those that are harmed and those who did the harming, right? Um, and one aspect of that, I want to talk about the first tenet, attentiveness. So, um, attentiveness means essentially like being aware. It requires a kind of awareness of what's going on with a particular people, right? Um, one needs to know what to look for, right? One needs to know about their needs, right? Um, attentiveness, I equate attentiveness with a kind of awareness, right? Attending to. And responsiveness is the second tenet. I equate that to how you respond um, to what you're aware of, right? Now that you know certain things, how are you required or how are you going to respond to the need of the other? Um, the third tenet is responsibility. Um, and responsibility is like what role, like what role specifically for ADOS, like what role does this university or government or institution, whatever, what role did they play in harming this group, right? And how are they going about accept? How are they going to go about accepting that responsibility? Like, what does that mean for them, right? Does it mean uh, offering scholarships? Does it mean offering for government? Does it mean offering reparations in various forms? Like, what does that mean? Taking responsibility and competence. Um, and competence. Do you have the ability to repair? Um, and do you have the ability, the competence to know uh, who needs repaired, right? Because if everything is in broad racial categories, and you don't have the means to distinguish the conceptual resources to distinguish ADOS from the larger Black African American category, then it seems like you don't have the competence to even engage in repair. Does that make sense? The latter part. So, and and I argue that care is not a charity; it's a political responsibility. Um, so, like institutions, governments have to respond to the harms, the vulnerabilities that they help create, right? So, like among the universities that I named, right? Like UVA specifically is doing something to address the harms that um, to address the harms that they placed upon the enslaved at their institute, right? Um, uh, because they were responsible, like they're the party that engaged in the harm. For example, the United States government, in terms of reparations for ADOS, the United States government is the entity that sanctioned slavery, that made slavery legal. Um, um, so, and again, I think the thing about ethics of care that's very important to remember is that it's a it's based on relationality, right? The relationship between entities, right? So I specifically argue that ADOS and the United States government or institutions that harm them have a specific, unique relationship. In one sense, for the United States government, for example, ADOS's relationship to the United States and the government and the culture. Um, I should say, well, the government and culture help create, it played a part in creating who they were as a people, right? So that's a relationship that ADOS has to the country. Um, and the country has a relationship to ADOS because they played a role in harming them, at least the federal government. They played a role in harm or sanctioning their harm. So, so yeah, so ADOS and the entities that harm them have a specific relationship, right? And um, I don't know. I'm saying this kind of creates a kind of um, I don't know. I guess you could say a kind of I would even say kind of obligation um, uh, of the one who engaged in harm to repair or to the best of their ability the party that they harm. Um, and I guess the thing is that like Um, I think another thing I want to say is that like repair is twofold, right? Because in one sense, there's a repair about identity, and there's a repair that's a material repair, right? Um, so if there's epistemic injustice, that means that suggests that there's a kind of epistemic justice, right? So epistemic justice would require um, that groups of people who have been buried in these large umbrella, big tent racial categories be seen, that they are seen, right, as a distinct group of a specific justice claim, and not subsumed into that larger category, and not seen. Um, so that would be the epistemic justice, and because the group of ADOS were harmed, they have a specific um, uh, they're in need of a specific material repair, right? Because the harm that was done against them hurt them materially, right? Their bodies, their wealth, or lack of wealth, all that requires a material repair. So I'm asking. So this is talking about repair in identity, right? Being seen as a distinct group. Um, um, which the UN has written about, right? That people have a right to be seen. Ethnic groups have a right to be seen. People have a right to be seen and not have their histories erased, right? Um, and they have a right to a material redress, right? And I think too many times in our society that we pay way too much attention to the material redress. I mean, it's the more practical thing to pay attention to, obviously. But it seems to me that you can't engage in one, the material redress, if you don't know the people you're talking about. If you can't point them out or they can't identify themselves in order for that material redress to even affect them in the first place, because you don't know who you're talking about or you can't identify them, right? Um, and so, like, um, I think too, like getting into like very contemporary things, like a couple of years ago, 2024, um, there's a group called the ADOS Advocacy Foundation, and there were a series of hearings to change the statistical policy directive number 15, which in which groups are allowed to people advocate for bringing up new ethnic or racial categories um, uh, in federal policy documents, right? Or federal documents like the census. And the category ADOS or variations of it was rejected. It was rejected by the Office of Management and Budget because there weren't enough stakeholders advocating for it. They didn't have the numbers that they needed, right? Um, and so again, one thing I want listeners to know that this is a very, I guess it suffices to say, this is a very political conversation. And one thing that was very disappointing was like legacy groups that people equate with Black America, such as the NAACP and the Urban League, were against creating a distinct category for American descendants of slavery or variations of that name that has signified that one was a descendant of the enslaved in the United States. And they were against it because they thought it would cause division within Blacks in America. And so that was for me personally, it was a very disappointing to hear. So they didn't have the support that they needed. Excuse me. Um, so they worried that it was divisive because like they're the you know, as more black immigrants come into the country, they were more concerned about black political power, worried about black political power, rather than a group of people trying to come together, uh, legitimize, institutionally legitimize their identity and use that as a way to uh, get reparations, right? Um, I think, and I guess on a more cultural front, um, I think people see it as divisive because um, people may see it as divisive because it doesn't fit into the mold of the kind of the broad racial coalition that people are so used to black people being in this country. This is something new for many people. Um, some people see it as a divide and conquer strategy, again, to split like black political power, rather than like a legitimate strategy, political strategy to bring about reparations, right? And to acknowledge that um, ADOS is a distinct ethnic category or ethnic group. Um, so again, like I just want to say, like I kind of want to end on this. I feel like I've been going on for a while, but ADOS are like this ignorance about the ADOS ethnicity and lineage is it's structural. It's not accidental. It's hundreds of years in the making. Um, and it's built into policies. It's built into the frameworks we use to interpret public discourse. Right? It's everywhere. It's the air we breathe. So, um, and the only way to repair, um, to engage in reparations for ADOS on the epistemic front and the material front is to acknowledge them as a specific ethnic group with a specific justice claim in the United States. Um, and like, you can't do that if you're consistently relying on frameworks that erase them or obscure their justice claim or obscure their existence, right? So, um, I don't know. I think I think step one is just first like acknowledge them as a distinct group. That be acknowledged as a distinct group federally, and then you take it from there politically. But without the epistemic justice, I think a material justice, material repair, or as some people say in the community, the tangibles don't take place. And so, yeah, that's my talk. Um, I'll be glad to take any questions if anyone has any.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, James Murray. Dr. James Murray now. Um, yes, I've been furiously taking notes. But I do want to open the floor before I start asking questions
Okay.
to anyone who else might have them. have the floor. No pressure, though.
Yeah.
Um, I have a question about
Okay.
care as a political responsibility. Uh,
Hmm.
so we must respond to the harm that the government must respond to the harm that they helped create on so many levels. Uh,
Hmm.
how do we promote this epistemic identity that we as a public can latch on and know to? How do we make that accessible? As you said, um, this idea is new and scary, and people will see it as
Hmm.
divisive. But if we need this epistemic injustice in order to at least clear the way for the possibility of material justice,
Right.
how do we how do we make it more palatable without whitewashing the experiential aspects of
Well,
the identity?
one thing you can do is get rid of the impediments in the way. For example, like, I mean, again, this is very political. Like, a few years back, there was issues about the teaching of Black American history in schools, in high schools specifically, like taking out they kind of reconfigured or took out the AP African American exam or something like that. I don't have my facts straight on that, but there was like the censoring of Black American history um, in states like Florida and Texas, calling like the enslaved migrant workers, like that in itself is a form of epistemic injustice, right? You're calling people who are chattel, right? And I want to remind the listeners that chattel comes from the word cattle, or rather, the word cattle comes from chattel, right? So you are talking about people who are literally viewed as livestock that engaged in labor, people who were bred like livestock, by the way, after the end of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States in the years 1807, circa 1807, 1808. Of course, there was a lot of illegal uh, transatlantic slave trading that went on after that. But in the after that period, there's a lot of breeding, right? I know Virginia itself has I forgot the name of it, but there's a breeding farm down there in Virginia that a lot of people. It kind of baffles the mind that a lot of people don't even know about this stuff. That people were bred like animals in the United States. Um, so what can we do? Like again, like first thing is like stop um, contorting the history, uh, engaging in erasure, um, erasure of a people's history, right? Um, Second of all, I think, and this is the kind of question that keeps me up at night, right? Like I don't, because you're fighting against centuries. You're fighting against centuries of like imposed like structural ignorance, right? Um, that wasn't meant to afford those deemed or racialized as black. At, it was never meant for them to be afforded ethnic identity. Um, Blackness and to many people, if I just say ADOS, like blackness and ADOS is essentially a tautology to them, right? Like, and it's in like how do you I don't know, how do you separate that? How do you disassemble that? How do you break that apart? And I think, frankly, like as a political strategy, not really a political strategy, but as one thing that needs to happen, I think a lot of this stuff has to happen within the community that is affected materially and epistemically by this, by the structures that harm them. I think I think even within the ADOS community, just people, not all black people, but black folks who are ADOS. I think with them, there's even a big divide within, I should say, my community about this. Because again, some people see it as a divide and conquer, like we need to stick together no matter where we're from, which is that kind of Pan-Africanist perspective, right? And then there's a perspective like, well, we're here in this land. We've been here for hundreds of years. This is who we are. This is our culture. America made us. Reparations is not charity; it's a debt owed. Um, and like we can't make that claim if we put everybody on that. If we put all of us on the same boat, right? Because all black people don't have that same justice claim. They didn't suffer multi-generational harm. You didn't suffer multi-generational harm and you just got here from Nigeria in 1990. You know, it didn't happen to you. And frankly, I don't mean to sound too contentious, but I think one reason that this issue is divisive is that I think some groups, particularly some black immigrant groups, have been able, and there are studies on this, they've been able to benefit from some of the past affirmative actions, past affirmative action that solely benefited ADOS folks. And as the numbers have changed, and because they've been able to mark that Black African American category, they've been able to benefit from it. And I think by making this split, some of these folks won't be able to benefit in the way that they were in the past. But they've been able to do in the past. And so the end of like race-based affirmative action in higher education, the Supreme Court has said like, hey, like in order for like someone to get preferable considerations or a leg up, if you will, like we need to see a traceable harm. Like we can't base the need for affirmative action on these broad on the broad racial category, because broad racial categories were considered is based on broad societal discrimination, right? But like we need something that we can see. We need actual evidence that you've been harmed by this system, right? And one way you can do that is by tracing lineage, right? So if I'm an I'm a ADOS person. I'm one generation removed from sharecropping. And before my great grandfather, who was born in Pulaski County, Arkansas in 1885, 100 years before I was born, I looked at his World War II draft card and it has him as a farmer. And if you know about ADOS folks and these draft cards that say farmer, or in the census it says farmer for black folks down south, most of the time they made you a sharecropper, right? So that man was one generation removed, that man was one generation removed. He was born 20 years after the end of slavery, right? So he was he was affected by it, right? And just looking at my own lineage, I can see how that affects me today, right? And the hardships and that's caused in my own family, right? Over time. Um, but I think too, on a broader scale, I think there's something about people being afraid to acknowledge difference in people's experiences. Um, I think a lot of people on the left side of the spectrum, in the center and the left side of the spectrum, like when it comes to identity politics, we put ourselves in these broad coalitions. We use terms like people of color and things like that, assuming that all people of color experience certain acts of discrimination based on race the same way, right? Or the Black and Brown coalition, right? Assuming that folks who are designated mestizo Latinos or Hispanic experiences discrimination the same way that uh, Black people in general, regardless of their ADOS or not, experience racial discrimination in the same way. And like we have the evidence that we know that's not true, right? Again, the devil is always in the details when it comes to that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure if I'm just going on a random, if I'm answering the question or not, but I don't know. It's kind of hard to address something that's so structural. And epistemological, right? But like, how can you get people to see people as distinct when they've been indoctrinated a certain way by the society in which they live? I honestly don't have any good answers, frankly. The only way I know you can do that is through people educating themselves through education. Because it's not, I don't think this is something that can come from the top down. It has to go from the bottom up. Yeah. Right? People have to have this gain a certain kind of consciousness and then bring it to the levers of government and advocate for that specific thing that they want, a specific ethnic category that they want. It's not going to come from the bottom down. I mean, from the top down, excuse me.
Yeah. No, you did directly answer my question and very thoroughly. Thank you. No, that's, so do you think that we should have, I don't know, a community, a strategy like, ooh, maybe just in Philly, for example, we'll hit this side of town, this side of town, this side of town, and this side of town, and we'll build, sort of a community night once a month to try to educate folks. Are you thinking that sort of grassroots, ground up education, or do you think we start just with the textbooks, with what's happening within the institutions?
I think it's going to have to start with. I think this is the thing that has to start with the grassroots movements, and furthermore, it's going to have to. With Afro-pessimism, I want to say Afro-pessimism makes it seem like it just can't happen, right? It's called Afro-pessimism for a reason, right? And Afro-pessimism would actually say that the only way that ADOS will be acknowledged as a specific ethnic entity is for the world to be redone or remade ontologically, right? Because our very category of the rights-bearing citizen, our very category of human, comes from being distinguished from being black, right? So they would say that the world needs to be redone ontologically. That's a very tall order. I'm not going to. I am definitely not up for that, but um, I don't know. I think it would have to come from. I do think education is a very important aspect of it, and I think there needs to be um, more. Well, first of all, I think like there needs to be academia. Since we were talking about this before the for my talk, I think academia needs to be more open to hearing about this, right? To be open to teaching about this and reading about this and making this part of African American discourse and uh, making this part of like discourse in academia, not just like um, not just in African American courses, history courses, or African American or race courses, but also like in sociology or identity formation uh, courses dealing with things like that. Um, I think that's something that academia can do in terms of post-secondary education. K through 12, I think like the textbooks would actually do a good job by like opening, maybe introducing that term. These are distinct. Oh, these black slaves were brought from Africa, and instead of saying like, you know, uh, introducing like how they formed a unique culture over time, over hundreds of years in the American context. Um, Not only talking about what they contributed culturally, but like how they are through lineage, through aspects of culture, through language, through so on and so forth, a distinct group of people. Um, and one thing I'm really proud of is the fact that my inclusion in that textbook, that Macmillan textbook, the Ta-Nehisi Coates and Dr. William Darity, is that like I think it's the first time that the term ADOS has been used in a mainstream publication used for high school students. So, like, introduce ADOS to a new generation, and I'm very proud of. That's another reason why I'm very proud of that. Um, and so,
As you should be. As you should.
yeah. Any questions, Wilma? No pressure. Okay. Um, I think um, so. When I was thinking about talking about this last night, one thing I do think I should bring to uh, attention is if you go online, like there's a similar designation referred to as FBA. I don't know if you've heard that before, Kelly. Um, so FBA means Foundational Black Americans. And in essence, they're referring to the same people as ADOS, right? These are Black Americans who have been enslaved, who are have a distinct presence in the United States over hundreds of years, right? Um, However, there tends to be, so FBA is not really, it's a cultural designation. Um, ADOS, so ADOS uh, actually comes from a political movement, right? The ADOS Advocacy Foundation. You can look it up online. I believe it's adosaf.org. Um, I'm cursing you.
Go for it.
Yeah, I would say ADOS is fuck.org, but anyway. But yeah, so ADOS stands for ADOS AF stands for ADOS Advocacy Foundation. But I would say ADOS is fun. But anyway, so they're actually a political organization that engages in the work, right? Trying to get ADOS on the SPD number 15 uh, designation as a ethnic group, right? So they actually engage in the political work, right? They have teach-ins. Um, they have book clubs. They support certain people in state legislatures. They have chapters across the country. They're small, but they punch above their weight. I'll say that. And I'm very proud of them. But this FBA designation, I'm very leery of them because they're not really an organized movement. It's like it's just a bunch of people, random people, using it as a cultural designation to say, hey, my ancestors have been here for hundreds of years, and I have this distinct cultural identity. But they don't necessarily really engage in the political work. Some of them do. Um, um, and the reason why I make this distinction is because it reminds me of the split between the political and cultural split in the 1960s between the Black Panther Party and this group called US or US, United Slaves, started by Ron Karenga or Dr. Malana Karenga. You may know Dr. Ron Karenga or Malana Karenga as the founder of the holiday Kwanzaa. He was an FBI informant, by the way. So it reminds me of that kind of split that happens in Black movements, particularly ADOS movements, where there's a political wing, there's a political force that seems to do the actual, like, boots on the ground, like, practical work, right? And then there's this entity that does this kind of like cultural stuff. And for United Slaves, like, their cultural thing was like, I'm going to wear dashiki and I'm going to change my name and I'm going to celebrate my African heritage and I'm going to participate in Kwanzaa. And not to diss Kwanzaa or anything like that, but like, I don't know, first of all, the fact that Karenga was a FBI informant makes me think certain things about people trying to eradicate movements that are serious, because these two groups are kind of pitted against each other. And that's kind of the thing that I see the media doing with the ADOS and FBA. They equate the two groups. They equate the two. When one group is actually doing serious work, and the other one is just on Twitter and social media calling Black immigrants out of their name and causing conflict. And I'm very tired of seeing it, frankly. And like, our job is not to be here making fun of immigrants or talking about immigrants that make fun of black immigrants that make fun of Black Americans, whatever. Like, our goal is to designate a space for ourselves and to engage in the work of reparations. Over centuries old project, right, at this point. So that's a kind of a parallel that I thought about yesterday that just came out of just kind of like a eureka moment, if you will. So um, yeah. Um, Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to bring up. Um, I think too, if I may bring in some personal experience, for the first time in for the first time in like 2024, I visited uh, the DC Museum, the African American History and Culture Museum in DC. I visited twice, but when I visited for the first time, I was kind of surprised. Um, I was surprised about some things, and it was a it's a wonderful place. I love it. But one thing that kind of upset me, and I think this is can be very divisive even among ADOS folks, is like I really hate the fact. Hate is a very strong word. I really hate the fact that Barack Obama was included in that museum. Could you understand why I would be upset by that based on everything I've been talking about and knowing his background? Okay, so Barack Obama, first, he considers himself a black man, and I don't, that he identifies how he identifies. I don't have a problem with that. But like, for me, like when I thought about the African American History Museum, Museum of African American History and Culture, I thought like this is like ADOS folks, right? Um, and then I'm seeing quotes by Nelson Mandela, and I was like, because I was working on my dissertation, I like this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Like we're so interchangeable with one another. Like they don't even care. This guy's from South Africa, right? He experienced the system of apartheid in a whole different country and a whole like I know he's a world figure, I get it, but like, and I don't have any problems like with them making allusions to him, but like it was just kind of weird. It was like, do we even know what African American like what do you mean when you say that? Like what do you mean? Are you just saying black people who are in America? Is that what you mean? Or are you talking about a specific kind of people who are black that are in America? Like, what are you talking about? Because Barack Obama is the son of a Kenyan immigrant, a Kenyan man, and a white American mother. Nowhere in there is he a descendant of black Americans who were enslaved in the United States. Maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. Um, so I don't know. It's like I went with a white friend to it, and she just didn't get why I was upset by that. She really didn't understand it. She couldn't get it. She didn't get it. And it's like if you tell a lot of white folks that they don't get it. They really don't. It's like, but he's black though, and you know you're black, and why aren't you happy about it? And, like they just don't get it. But like imagine like going into going into a museum named the Irish American History and Culture Museum, and you're a proud Irish American. And all of a sudden, you see quotes from this Italian dude, and you see quotes um, from a president of some Italian American, some quotes from a picture, or whatever, from some guy who was president of some big Irish American organization,
Or
who
worse,
just happened, who just
Churchill.
happened, who just happened to be Italian, right?
Yeah.
And I, as a black person, like, why are you mad? I mean, y'all all white to me. Like, I don't get it. Like, I don't like. Why are you like? And that's like, she really couldn't understand. And like, I really saw the depths of how structural and like how ignorant people are to this stuff. They just don't see it.
Yeah.
It's kind of scary, actually. Um,
And then from a like a benign example, I'm coming from
no,
it just then people get stuck into this age of, well, I'm speaking my truth and my interpretation on things,
uh,
which adds this extra layer of you're not getting what I'm saying. So for example, I'm teaching philosophy of medicine right now, and there's this topic of evidence-based medical practices, which is something specific. Now, when you feed it into this question into AI, it doesn't realize it's referencing something specific. It's thinking about the way that evidence is used in science. I'm like, well, no, all science uses evidence, but this means a particular thing. And then when I'm
mm,
trying to communicate with this with students, often I get, well, yes, but the way that the evidence is treated, and I'm like, no, we just need to define this term, this very particular term, which means something specific. Yes, it's mixed in with this grander term, evidence,
okay, okay,
but just because it's connected to this grander term doesn't mean that we can just interpret this specific term
to mean that,
light of
to
that
mean God,
general
right?
thing. So, and that's just happening on the level of philosophy of medicine class where we should be paying attention and not using AI. And then now you're put in a position that where you have to defend this ridiculous submission that you've given
Mm,
by backtracking, well, my truth and my interpretation of, and I'm like, well, I get it, I get it, I get it, but I'm asking you for the specific definition. So that is frustrating. And then to raise that to a cultural level and apply it to the evils of the United States. Oh my gosh, with all of
yeah,
the levels that you illuminated, where this is sedimented into our psyche so
right,
deeply that we just can't even see it.
right,
Um, the I can see why you're mad, and
yeah.
the extent of the work to be done
It-
is
it- it-
overwhelming.
I want to say one more thing because I can go on and on, and then I should probably go. But one thing I did notice though, and I read about this in my dissertation research. This was really funny is that at least in higher education, not even just in higher education, but I should say American society in general, is that I know at least there's this book called um, it's a sociological book. It's called The Remaking the Black American. Uh, I believe it's by a guy named Todd. I think his name is last name is Hamilton. If I'm not mistaken, you can look it up. Or I can look it up. It's called The Remaking of Black America, and it talks about how the influx of Black immigrants uh, has changed basically Black America. And in one section, it talks about how white Americans view the difference between uh, people who are designated as ADOS and Black immigrant groups. And what's interesting is that many white Americans will make the distinction when they actually want to. When it comes to employment, when it comes to okay, it's called Immigration and the Remaking the Black American. It's by Todd Hamilton. And so there, the section talks about like how like white employers will like specifically hire Black folks that they know come from immigrant backgrounds because they think they'll work harder, because they view Black Americans as lazy, or how certain higher education institutions actually prefer like African immigrant students as opposed to ADOS folks because of the kind of cultural similarity. And when I say cultural similarity, I mean like coming from like the same kind of class background, right? because many Black immigrants who come to many, not all, but who come to the United States to study, particularly in grad programs, whatever, they come from like middle class or upper middle class in their respective countries. So they have a certain way that they carry themselves in the world that kind of resonates with many of the white uh, professors and folks on these committees making decisions to bring them in. It kind of resonates with them. They come from very similar like class backgrounds. Um, so like, and what institutions will do is they'll say, like, no, we're not being discriminatory because look at him, he's Black, even though they select for the kind of Black people that they want. So, and this is called covering, right? Um, uh, there's a scholar that talks a lot about this. Um, gosh, what is her name? I can't think of her name right now, but she's done a couple of studies on in higher education where she discovered that how like certain schools like prefer like African second generation students or whatever because they possess certain traits that resonated with the people on these selection committees. So I don't know. It's just it's kind of it's weird because like it's selective. It's a kind of selective ignorance, right? Um, like you see it when you don't. You see it when you want to, when it favors you in some way, right? Is what her study suggests. So I think I want to end on that note, if you don't mind. So,
I think
unless you got another question.
no, that's a very poignant point to
Mhm.
land on. And
Mhm.
this discussion has been very fruitful in terms of
I hope so. I hope so.
not only identifying what's going on, but in terms of all the layers that often go unnoticed. For example, with Barack Obama, but you also gave such hope, I think, in outlining what the ADOS Foundation is doing with grassroots,
Mhm.
and the work that you're doing at the level of high school textbooks. I think that
Mhm.
at least points to a positive impact
Yeah.
that this mission can have on policy, but also people's realities. So that's beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, welcome. Welcome.
Yeah.
Um, sorry.
All right. So I'll
All right.
I'll press stop record, and we'll see
Okay.
you all next time. Thank you. Thank you.